Hello guys and welcome back to this new video. So today we are going to discuss syndromes, the most fascinating, the most bizarre syndromes, of course coming from the recent field of neuroscience. We are going to give and get an understanding about syndromes, and of course the starting point is this guy. This guy's right here is the story that is most impressed in my mind from my studies. His name is Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage lived towards the end, anyway, second half of the 19th century. He was a worker on a railroad. There was an accident and an iron bar went through his head, his skull, and basically literally crossed his skull and penetrated his skull in a way that is slightly tilted, right? So Phineas Gage was, before the accident, a very normal man, right? Didn't exhibit any weird or strange behavior. He was completely normal, married, very polite, like a gentleman, right? But then the iron bar touched his left frontal lobe, and what happened there is that his behavior after the accident completely changed. He was blind from one eye, but that's not what is relevant here. What was relevant was the change in attitude and perspective in Phineas Gage's behavior. His decisions were more and more subdued, his impulsiveness, and his whole social behavior especially was completely modified. He would swear a lot, he would have some sort of irrational behaviors, he would be disrespectful to rules and people he knew and loved, and so on and so forth, right? And that is obviously because of the damages that the left frontal lobe had suffered, and the left frontal lobe, or frontal lobe in general, is the part of the brain that regulates those kind of behaviors. The reason why we mention it here, though, is because we want to have him as an introduction for the most bizarre syndromes. Syndrome number 1 is the Tourette syndrome. It's a syndrome that was discovered in 1884. Even recently, I saw an actor stating that he suffers from Tourette and he was being bullied because of that reason. But I want to underline here, first and foremost, that the syndrome of Tourette is a real syndrome. And so sometimes, the symptoms might be very weird and eccentric, but they actually depend on certain neurophysiological factors, and this is the case. There are different symptoms that one can experience with the Tourette syndrome. Certainly there are spasms and some movements that cannot be controlled by the subject, and that basically make the subject move in a very bizarre way. We also know that Tim Howard, the saver of the soccer or football, I don't really know because I don't follow, American team, suffers from this syndrome, and we suspect that Mozart probably also suffered from this syndrome. The more acute syndrome is the loss of language, right? And we also know that 0.05% of the population suffers from this disease in a proportion that is 4 women to 1 man. But with that being said, it's very important to underscore here that the Tourette syndrome is, I wouldn't say quite spread, I would say relatively spread, and can, lead people to a very flamboyant way of speaking. To my knowledge, with a lot of swear words, and that depends on lack of social control, because again something is malfunctioning in the frontal lobe. Syndrome number 2. Madame M was convinced that her husband wasn't really her husband, that whoever she was seeing must have been a copy of her beloved husband. Now, why did she think like that? And there is a syndrome. The syndrome we're talking about today, right now, is a syndrome that has been named after his discoverer, who was Joseph Capgras. In 1923, Joseph Capgras individuated this specific syndrome that pretty much corresponds to the confabulatory behavior of at least one part of our hemisphere in our brain. So basically what happens is this, right? We know things. We know that there is a tree, we know that there is a curtain, we also know that our husband is our husband, right? We are also able to detect, just by looking at somebody, to detect that person and to detect, facial features that are so relevant that we will remember that person, even if that person has put on like 20 kilos, or if that person has lost a lot of weight, right? We go like, oh, you're familiar. Oh yeah, I remember you, right? Now, specifically for the people that we love, this applies very well in a sense, not that we don't see them in 20 years, but it applies very well in the sense that we see them and then we feel some sort of emotion. For instance, when we haven't seen our relatives, parents, kids for some time, we see them, we smile, we're looking forward to meeting them, right? There is a affection program has been defined that connects their faces, because this is about faces, connects their face to our emotional reaction. But in the case of the Capgras syndrome, we do have an emotional detachment. In other words, we're not able to understand who they are. We know that they look like a certain way. We do know that that looks our husband or our wife, but we're not able to recognize it. And so the emotional attachment that glues together our feeling with that person doesn't work really well, and our brain goes, okay, so then to make sense of the whole story, you must be an imposter, like you must be a copy, somebody that looks like my husband, but really you're not my husband. This seems to me the following more severe step than derealization and depersonalization. So we know that in those states, basically, because we undergo an intense stress, we detach, and the moment we detach, the moment our brain detaches from a situation that perceives like a nightmare, right? And let's imagine that it detaches not just for a second, but for a protracted period of time, then at that point we start disintegrating. Like, we can actually know rationally that that is our mother's voice, but we will not be able to integrate that voice that we understand very well to be our mother's from, or we're not able to reconnect that voice with her face, right? And so it will look like we are having in front of ourselves our mother, but then she's speaking, but then the voice is somewhat silent, and her speech is coming from a different source, even though the voice is the same, but it's kind of like disintegrated and not reconnected, right? And that depends on what a neuroscientist, and the term is going to be very reductive for him, Antonio Damasio, has described in terms of familiarity program and in terms of affection program. That is what allows us to recognize somebody and associate with that person a certain emotion, a specific emotion that is connected to our past, our history, and our current feeling about that person. Now, here it is worth mentioning that Capgras syndrome is actually the exact opposite to another syndrome that is, of another syndrome that is prosopagnosia. and that is the incapacity of the inability to recognize faces, right? So when Oliver Sacks wrote the man who mistook his wife for a hat was referring exactly to that kind of scenario. So this time around, we don't have a a situation where we acknowledge that that person is that person to us and has a certain role in our life, but we cannot fully make out who is, and so we think it's a substitute, it's an imposter, it's somebody who like some sort of doppelganger, but we are in the opposite situation. And that is when we believe that this person, we don't believe that that person is this person because we cannot fully understand the facial features of that person. But paradoxically, we are in a position where basically, even if we don't recognize that person, we feel some sort of sympathy. We have positive feelings about that person. Even Oliver Sacks himself experienced exactly this kind of feeling, and that was interesting because a couple of times or more he didn't recognize his own therapists, and that made him like be in the shoes of one of his patients at least. Other syndrome is that of Fregoli. The name is Italian because it takes the name from a transformist, so somebody who performed quick change kind of performances, right? And in the people who suffer from this syndrome believe that basically the person is always the same, but it just changes look, changes dress, and even though I don't know it very, very well, I could tell you that it has a persecutory kind of connotation because when the person believes that is being stalked, is being persecuted, basically, it believes that the same person in different looks is persecuting him or her. And so that has a very negative connotation to it. Another syndrome that honestly I didn't know before starting the research for this video is a syndrome that I absolutely love. So basically it is the syndrome of the foreign accent, right? Also known as foreign accent syndrome. It is the story of a woman, we are in 1941, that wakes up in a hospital in Norway. We are in the middle of the Second World War, 1941, and basically she speaks Norwegian, definitely, and she knows the language very well, but the problem is that she speaks with a foreign accent, ironically and paradoxically with a German accent. Now, why am I saying that? Because of course of the war, and she was for a short period of time believed to be also a German spy. In reality, what they discovered is that there is a syndrome that causes a mislocation and misplacement of the jaw and jawline and tongue also, that determines one person to speak with a completely different accent. So in other words, if I speak English, I'll end up speaking English but with a French accent. Not bad overall, yeah. Very important to notice here is that while she was singing, while this woman, Norwegian woman with a German accent was singing, the problem of accent completely disappeared, which is not something entirely new, exactly because we know of foreign singers that then sing in a different language, and we say, oh, that's good enough, right? We cannot hear the accent. So one thing is a mispronunciation, but the accent cannot really be perceived in music, and that is the same factor that is reflected in this story. Now it is the moment, the turn to talk about another couple of syndromes. So we have somatophrenia on the one hand, and on the other hand, the syndrome of the phantom limb. So these two syndromes, let's start from the first one. Somatophrenia or somatophrenia is the syndrome according to which basically we no longer, due to a bunch of different factors, acknowledge that a part of our body is a part of our body. So in other words, we pick a limb or another part of our body, and we start thinking that that is not ours, that doesn't belong to us. So I see my hand and I go like, my hand is not mine, just to give you an example. Now, this usually happens a lot with the limbs, and that is a thing, that we can also have when we suffer from derealization and depersonalization in acute phases. What we have is basically the sensation, the feeling that that part of our body is not our own. That is exactly the opposite of the phantom limb syndrome, right? A syndrome that was described also by Ramachandran. It is a syndrome that basically our body keeps on perceiving a limb that is not there because it has been amputated, and so we're lacking of a part, but we still feel that part as existing, right? And here we have Ramachandran. Now, there is a theory that has been explained in a couple of books. The one concerning the phantom limb theory or syndrome has been a little explained in the book that is called The Woman That Died Laughing, and the second book that I have is called The Telltale Brain. And in those books, Ramachandran describes that there is a mental representation ongoing in our head that keeps on allowing the perception of the world and of the body, because we have to remember, it is important to do that, we have to remember that the body is the medium, the means through which we perceive the world. And Ramachandran says it's like there's another little mini ourselves in our head, in our brain, that controls and keeps the representations of the world and the body exactly how we know it in our brain. So interestingly, but also somehow obviously, what we have here is an important contradiction. So our visual cortex sees and notices that we don't have any longer anymore a part of our body, right? But then again, our brain keeps on projecting that mental representation, and so we live in this very conflictual, if you like, state where we perceive something that is really not there. Our next syndrome is the Parkinson's disease, right? The Parkinson's syndrome, right? We are not going to describe what Parkinson's is because we assume that there has been enough exposure, enough quite famous people, including one pop, suffering from it. So we kind of understand what that is. What interests us today instead is the connection between Parkinson's and creativity. It has been proven that there is this connection, that there is a novelty sort of compensation of dopamine in our brain, and so those people become more and more creative, right? They develop kind of that side of things. It's a similar thing to what happens when somebody suffers from bipolar disorder. Like for instance, Virginia Woolf or Edward Monk were rumored to suffer from bipolar disorder, and so to have more creativity because they go into those maniac phases where one is very down and the other one is very up, and that fires up basically the brain with a lot of dopamine. And also, we have to basically here mention the fact that there are other people, other artists that have taken amphetamines exactly for that reason, to stimulate their creativity. but that's, you know, minor issue, in a sense, not for them. For them it's very important, but that is all I wanted to say about Parkinson's disease. And I'm moving on to our next syndrome that is quite interesting to me. I didn't know exactly this syndrome before reading about it. I found it extremely terribly fascinating. It is called the de Clermont syndrome, and it talks about the story of a woman. She's 53 at the time. We are in 1921. She thinks she is in a relationship with the King of England, George V. Something that I do find extraordinary per se. She believes she has this relationship, and she does communicate with him because of or through the position of the curtains of Buckingham Palace. She is, by the way, French, and I also believe living in France. So I didn't know. I don't know exactly how she was gonna check exactly the curtains, but anyway, this is what was reported, and it might have started from a traumatic rejection, and then develops into a whole completely distorted fantasy of having a relationship, a serious one, by the way, because she didn't portray herself as a mistress. She portrayed herself as a woman having a relationship with, and so it's a fantasy that develops as a form of delusion to compensate the rejection that has been suffered, where the other party involved is somebody extremely famous, rich, wealthy, you know, that has a social standing that is superior, in this case to the woman, but in general to the party that is suffering from this delusion. With that being said, though, guys, I want to stop here after having talked to so many syndromes. I want to stop here and leave to you the last word. So please comment below, subscribe to the channel, let me know what you think. Which syndrome have you preferred? And let me know. We're gonna talk next time in a new video about a new different topic. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment below, leave a like, and bye.